Sheesh. Big time. No man now. Diamonds in my teeth. I got a lot of shine.
Ho, 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 baby. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the DFS Army Fantasy Football Show. I am your host, of course, Flex Shane. I got my guy, the original best ball degenerate himself, Chris Felicetta. Chris, what's going on, brother? Thanks for joining the show today.
Not much, man. Happy to be here. It is like real nut chopping season for daily fantasy, for best ball, for your season long, for everything. Week 12, we are ready to go, ready to see how many teams we could get into the money.
Yeah, man. So it's going to be a bit of a different format here. For those of you who've joined us every week, of course, you know we like to talk about our flex plays, which is basically our sleeper plays for the week, as well as answer any of your start sit questions. So absolutely, we still welcome any start sit questions you have in the chat. But today, what we're going to talk about a little bit about process, right? So we're obviously still in the heat of the season, Chris, but it's always good to look back and just understand processes. And a big part of that process is, of course, the draft season, right? And so for those of you who were able to join in the off season, you were on, Chris, talking about some of your best ball strategies, some of the best players you like taking on your teams. And you and I have been chatting pretty regularly, you know, just in the X streets. And we decided, listen, it was a good time to get you back on the show, talking a little bit about, especially for these best ball tournaments that we all entered in the off season, advancement rates. And you actually introduced me to a really cool website. It's called bbmdb.com. And for anybody who entered in those Best Ball Mania contests, you can go to that website. It's pretty user-friendly and search around and look at different players and their advancement rates on teams. You can look at your individual rosters to see what your advancement rate is and individual iterations and permutations with players on your team. So it's pretty interesting. And of course, we got Jen in the chat. Good morning, Jen. But yeah, so how you doing? Like, how? First of all, are you one of these people who follows your best ball teams on a weekly basis, or is it like I'm a set and forget it guy myself? Like I don't like to look into the end of the season.
No, I follow them every week. I can't resist, and I'm on that BBMDB site that you talked about constantly. Right now, I'm sitting at dead average advance rate, which is for someone who maxed BBM. That's 25 teams, 16%. 2 out of every 12, which is kind of a miracle because I largely faded the veteran running backs that are dominating the season. Like, I'm not the type of guy who's going to draft like running backs that are in their 7th, 8th, 9th season heavily. Like, that's what, if you look at Saquon's 7th year, Mixon 8th year, Kamara 8th year, Derrick Henry, 9th year. So these are guys I largely avoided, and somehow I'm still managing an average advance rate. So I guess I have to be pretty happy with that for now. And I have some well-constructed teams, so we'll kind of just see how it rolls.
Yeah, so we were chatting before the show started, and we were just saying that if we were looking at the Christian McCaffrey teams and their advancement rate, and it's currently at 3%. So to your point, just average, if you kind of just drafted at ADP, chances are you got about a 16% advancement rate. Again, just 2 out of 12. And 3% is Christian McCaffrey, which of course makes sense, right? Like he missed most of the season. But if you are part of that 3% and you have CMC going into the best ball playoffs, which is just like your regular fantasy football season playoffs, it's going to start in week 14. Or week 15, right? 15, 16, 17. Yeah. So week 15, 16, 17. So 3 more weeks. If you can get those points, if you have Christian McCaffrey, maybe he'll help sneak you in, itch up that 3%, and then you're laughing, man, because that's I would love to ride.
I don't think people realize how key that is for the best ball playoffs, because you have to kind of look at it like it's a DFS slate. Like if you could play a 3% owned Christian McCaffrey versus a 47% owned Saquon Barkley, and McCaffrey's going to project, like if you look at our DFS Army projections for this week, like McCaffrey probably projects a little bit higher than Saquon or equal at worst. So it would be a no-brainer to play the 3% McCaffrey over the 47% owned Saquon Barkley. Like that's just DFS 101. Like if you could ever had that opportunity, you would max enter and fire all your lineups on McCaffrey. So if you look at it like that, when you're playing against like 15 teams or 12 teams, whatever it is, in round 15 of week 15 of the playoffs for best ball, like that's a huge advantage if you did manage to sneak some CMC teams in. And obviously there's nothing you could do at this point to help that. But if you did happen to have a well-constructed CMC team that sneaks in, you're in a really good spot.
Yeah, so I just looked I went over to dfsarmy.com. It's a pretty good website, Chris. And I checked out my favorite tool. I talk about it on the show every single week. It's our matchup tool. That's one where it looks at obviously the matchups. It talks about our projections. It looks at ownership projections for both DK and FanDuel. And then it's also got just your point projection. So when I look at the FanDuel projection, which is half-point PPR, which is in line with the underdogs, we got Saquon, who's projected at 18 points, and then Christian McCaffrey is projected at 19 points. So they're pretty close.
Yeah.
But ultimately,
it's right
yeah. But I mean, it's to your point. It's actually it's funny. So in one of my leagues, one of my key leagues, it's a dynasty league, but I take the basically I would win back to back, which I'd win this big showdown pot, which would be pretty sick. So I'd say it's my most important league of the year. I'm playing a fellow dominant team, and he's got CMC and I've got Saquon Barkley. So it's going to be the battle of the Titans this week, and it's going to be fun. But what's kind of interesting, just like looking at the slate this week, Chris, is hopefully you haven't been living under a rock, ladies and gentlemen. But there are currently 6 teams on bye. Some would call it Bye-Mageddon. Some would call it a bicopolis. Bipocalypse.
there you go.
But yeah, so you've got like Buffalo Bills, the New York Jets, the Bengals, the Falcons, the Saints, and the Jaguars are all on by this week. So just looking at the Discord chat for DFS Army, there's some pretty skanky start-sit questions this week. And I just have friends, that will text me and say, hey, who should I start so-and-so or so-and-so? And it's like, it's pretty skanky this week. But there's also some key injuries. And going to that San Francisco game, Brock Purdy is out this week. So, Chris, if you put on your weekly fantasy football hat this week, how comfortable are you starting to fringe level players, right? Like, even though Debo has had admittedly his worst year, right? He says his worst year as a pro. Obviously, injury years don't count. So he's having a rough season. Christian McCaffrey is healthy. You're not benching him. George Kittle is unstoppable. You're not doing him. But what about like the Juwan Jennings of the world?
That's a tough one. I mean, it's really, I guess, would depend on who was your option as opposed to Jennings. Because I was looking until this kind of surprise Purdy news popped up. Mm-hmm. I was thinking Jennings was probably going to be one of my highest owned wide receivers on DraftKings this week for the week, the DFS stuff, because he's just been getting peppered with targets. But do you trust Brandon Allen to do that? Like, I think you could still put him out there in a pinch, but I would have to, know specifically like who are you debating against it with, like to make that decision. Because I definitely wouldn't feel confident in putting Jennings out there. Mm-hmm. I'm still going to put Debo out there. I mean, I think if you probably don't have a better option with 6 teams on bye on your bench than Debo Samuel. So I think you have to put him out there. But Jennings is a much tougher debate, I think, and more player specific.
Yeah, what's interesting, if you go to the DFS Army website and you look at the tool, the NFL Chalkboard, which is just the chalk plays of the week or the projected chalk plays of the week, Juwan Jennings for the wide receiver position is the 3rd highest projected at 15% over ownership. So maybe that's going to shift between now and Sunday, now that the news is officially dropped. I think it was yesterday morning that it officially dropped Friday morning.
This is pretty new news. So I do expect that number to go down. I don't think that 15% will be sticky with Brandon Allen in there, because there are other options around that price range. So I think that you'll see a lot of people that planned on playing Jennings all week are probably going to pivot off him. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's just my feeling about it.
That makes sense. So one of the players who was injured for most of the season, he's going to not play again this week, but that's Kansas City Chiefs running back Isaiah Pacheco. Hopefully he's back next week. I just checked that bbmdb.com website, and I see that the advancement rate is 8.2%, which means you're below the field if you draft an Isaiah Pacheco, which makes sense again, right? He's been injured for most of the season. But are there any players that you had a lot of exposure to that maybe have let you down for a bit of the season, but are starting to get back up. I know one of the players that I was super high on all off season was, well, both Michael Pittman and Anthony Richardson. Pittman, he's a write-off. That's it. I've resigned to fact that's probably a bust for the season. But we saw a little bit of hope with A-Rich last week. So hopefully moving forward, and Jen, who's in the chat, we did suggest you pick A-Rich up last week because she was looking forward to this week. That's just kind of next level fantasy football 101, right? But are there any players? Yeah, exactly. But are there any players that jump out to you that you'd like to see, and you think that if they have a good finish to the season, it might help squeak a few more teams into the playoffs?
Well, one of them is, I know, one of your favorite players in Devon A-Chain, because he obviously cratered when Tua was out. And if you look at his fantasy points per week, I think I heard a stat that in games with Tua starting, he's averaging 21 fantasy points per game. And that would put him right in line with like the Saquon, Derrick Henry, Mixon type guys that are dominating this season. So, and A-Chain, now that Tua is back, is one of the, I think, best options week to week at running back that you could have. And I have him on a lot of teams. He's actually probably the main reason I'm not overweight Saquon, because it was basically in a lot of drafts, you had that decision. Do I want in the second round? Do I want A-Chain? Do I want Saquon? And I kind of leaned more A-Chain just because we've seen the explosive upside that he had last year. And also, I thought the tush push was going to limit Saquon a decent amount. And it has. I think Hurts has, I think, 9 or 10 tush push touchdowns. Like, if you told me before the season Hurts was going to rush for that many tush push touchdowns, I don't think a lot of people would have drafted Saquon where he went. And also, as a Giants fan, he didn't look like he was. I love Saquon. I respect him. I think he's a great guy, a great player. I was sad to see him go. But I also thought he looked a little bit past his prime last year. Like, I didn't see this type of season coming for him. So, I mean, I'm happy for him and his family that he's playing this well and got that money. But I wanted to try to hit the monster season from A-Chan. So if he can kind of keep this up now, and I think Miami's going to try to make a playoff push. I doubt they'll get there, but they're like at least in the conversation. So I think they're going to really lean on A-Chain. And if he can keep it going with Tua under center, I think he's got a chance to kind of put a few more teams in the playoffs for me. And we've seen what he can do. Like, he can be the guy that separates, like in a week like week 16, week 17, when you need to have that 50-point score. We've seen that he can do it. So he's somebody that I'm looking at to really kind of help me out.
Yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago, Chris, but looking back to draft season, that was a constant debate that Brandon and I had on the show, was A-Chan and Saquon Barkley. And I love A-Chan, but Brandon was like the president of the A-Chan fan club, and he insisted, because I'm the one who worked on the DFS Army draft kit every season. I've been doing it. I think this was my third season now doing it. And I like to do tier-based drafting. So you have to bake in a lot of different things, such as ADPs, but I was generally ahead of consensus on both A-Chan and Saquon Barkley. So if you were using our draft kits, you should have a lot of both of those players. But that was the constant debate. Like, I had, because A-Chan, for the most part, for most of the season, draft season, was going around the end of round 2. Obviously, he moved up to probably mid to early round 2. And it got to the point where he was almost like a 1-2 turn type player. He was there. It was between him and Gibbs. But I always had the discipline to keep A-Chan right after Saquon Barkley. But obviously, depending on how you went, like, you had to make that choice. And so far so good. Really what it came down to, and we have a flag plant show before the start of every season, and Saquon was my number one flag plant this offseason. And a big part of that was simply because I just look at what Miles Sanders did a few years ago in this same offense. And it's basically the same offense that the Eagles are playing. And there's just so many opportunities. And when you have an elite talent like a Saquon, and maybe cover your ears for this one, Chris, but when you're playing for a franchise like the Giants, it's sometimes hard to go and just give it that extra 1, 2, 3% on game day, right? Like, Saquon's a baller. That's just in his DNA. But, when you play on a team like the Eagles, which to start the season, we're like, oh my God, is this momentum from the end of last season where they kind of shot the bed going to continue? But it seems like they've got their footing. And if you have a player like a Saquon, he probably is a league winner for you this year, like, without a doubt.
Oh, yeah. I think we looked on that BBMDB site, and I believe his advance rate was something like 42 or 44%. Like he is making your whole entire fantasy season for you if you drafted Saquon. Like if you've drafted Saquon in a home league, you're in the playoffs. If you drafted Saquon in best ball, there's almost a coin flip chance that team made the playoffs if you did nothing else right, just having Saquon. So will he be able to keep that up late in the season? It remains to be seen, but there's no reason. He's shown no signs of slowing down. And I think one thing I kind of maybe underestimated a bit is he went from the Giants probably have one of, if not the worst offensive lines in the NFL. And the Eagles have one of, if not the best offensive lines in the NFL. So when you put a talent like Saquon, give him that big of an upgrade of offensive line with holes to run through, it's going to make a huge difference. And I certainly wish I had more Saquon, but that was the thought process to led me to being slightly underweight on Saquon this year.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, to your point, it's 42% advancement rate if you've got Saquon Barkley, which is pretty disgusting. So are there any other players? And actually, no, so this is an interesting question I have for you. So this year, and actually the last few years, we've really seen this shift in these best ball tournaments where people are just so hungry to get those wide receivers early and often, right? But to your point, you mentioned at the start of the show, there's so many of these older running backs that are really just carrying teams. And so my question to you is, fast forward in only a few months, like a lot of these best ball contests are going to open up once again in February. Yeah. So it seems like a long time away. And I don't want to count, we don't want to count our chickens before they're hatched with this current season, but next February, we're degenerates. We're starting to draft best ball teams, Do you see a shift back to the running back position and just getting those solid players? Or do you say, listen, okay, this year was an anomaly. It's probably going to revert back to previous seasons, and we're going to start running the ball again or passing the ball again and just status quo. What do you think?
I do think there's going to be some bump up in running backs by the field. I do think that because you just can't ignore what's going on this year. That said, I do think this is a bit of an anomaly. Like, I think we could play this slate over if you could stimulate this NFL season 1,000 times. How many times are all of these late 20s running backs going to stay healthy? That's just so highly unlikely. And even someone like Connor or Dobbins, that's another guy that I faded. There's no history of a running back coming back from a torn Achilles and succeeding. And he was coming back from a torn Achilles the year after a multi-ligament ACL injury. And he's been a great pick this year. Mm-hmm. He's a guy who's played every game. I do think there's going to be, I'm hoping there's an overcorrection because I'm never going to be the guy that's drafting the old running backs consistently. But I think something that I need to do from a process standpoint is mix them in more with the younger players that I'm drafting, because maybe even if they do tend to get hurt later in the season, as they have in past seasons, they can build you a lead to let the younger players that you're drafting, that you're counting on late in the season, take over. I think guys like Mixon and Kamara, who were going in the 6th and 7th round of drafts, there wasn't, the cost of taking them was not prohibitive, and I should definitely have more of those guys. I think one of the reasons I don't have enough Mixon is because I was really big on the Houston passing game. I have Stroud is my highest owned quarterback, which looks bad right now, and two of my higher owned receivers are Nico and Diggs. Now, I think that's a little bit of run bad. I think Stroud could be having the type of season Burrow was having if everybody stayed healthy, but Diggs obviously tore his ACL, and Nico missed 5 games with, the hamstring injury. And that was a heartbreaker on, I believe it was Monday night when I'm waiting for 5 weeks for him to come back. He's probably my highest owned, early drafted receiver, hits a 77-yard touchdown to start the game. It gets called back, and then Mixon, who I'm underweight on, runs for 3 touchdowns. So I saw my, expected money on underdog just shrinking throughout that game. But it was a heartbreaker. But I do think, as you were asking earlier, I could see Nico being the type of player that comes on late in the season and decides a lot of fantasy leagues, because he was an absolute monster for the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season that he was healthy. I think he was the wide receiver 2. And now that he's there healthy without Diggs too, they're going to have to lean on him even more as they try to lock down a playoff spot. So I think like CMC, if you can sneak a low-owned Nico Collins into the playoffs, you're going to have a really interesting best ball team there, or even a season-long team if you manage to carry Nico this whole time.
Yeah, well, and just looking at this week, going back to the slate, like they're playing Tennessee this week, Houston is, and that's going to be interesting. It could be a get-right game for Houston because, I mean, like it kind of feels like Stroud's come back to earth a little bit as the season's gone on, but that could just be, nobody's really healthy this time of year, but I think it's been 10 days because it was a Thursday nighter before their bye last week.
Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. So I believe he's got the little mini bye type.
Yeah, mini bye, excuse me. Yeah. So that's definitely going to be interesting. And I mean, the risk though with that one is it's just going to be a mix and show, and take it to the house. But yeah, so look at this leaderboard. This is just sorting running backs by fantasy points scored. So you got Derrick Henry's number 1, Saquon's number 2, Alvin Kamara's number 3, which is insane. So then you've got Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall are right there. And Jahmyr Gibbs. So you've got that core 3. So if you did go one of those early running backs at the start of your draft, it's not going to kill you. It's not killing you, which is good. But they just haven't really gotten to that that next level, that elite level tier yet, where you're scoring 21, 22 points every single week. And it's like I mean. It's a no-brainer decision starts it, right? You're going to start those players no matter what, but like a Christian McCaffrey can melt a slate. If you've got him in your lineup and you're down 40 going into a Monday night, like he's the type of player that could win you that week still, and which is kind of insane. But then you look at after Jahmyr Gibbs, it's Joe Mixon right there on the leaderboard. So yeah, man. And then even David Montgomery, like he's having a hell of a season as well.
Yeah, he's just, what you're getting from him. You're not going to get the volume because Gibbs is there, but he is like a touchdown machine. And he's just like a solid bruiser of a back who's always going to give you something. He probably averages more than a touchdown a game over the last 2 years or right around that. And he's going to give you, solid rushing production. But I think he doesn't have I was underweight on him because he doesn't have the ceiling week to week. Like it's very hard to see him putting up that 30, 40-point week because Gibbs is always going to be taking such a large share of the work. But he's certainly somebody you love to have on a best ball week. Yeah. He gives you floor. Like he just gives you, a solid floor that you're never going to like put up those complete stinker of a weeks that submarine you and end your season.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, he was going right around like around 5-6, right? Like he was you still had to pay up a little bit to get a player like that, but you weren't playing like the King's Ransom round 1, 2, or 3 draft capital. To get him onto your team. So then tight end position this year, man, has been a bit of let's call it a roller coaster, right? I remember like to start the season, we were like, oh my God, like this was the year we hoped tight ends were going to break out. But as the season's kind of progressed, and you remember it was like tight end week in the NFL. And watching
National Tight End Day or whatever, they hammered it into the ground. They beat it into the ground. Yeah,
like every time, like they would freaking put the camera on a player, just National Tight End Day. But listen,
they all went off.
Astounding week. They all went off that week.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Again, looking towards next year, do you think that there's going to be any shift towards drafting tight ends early again? This year it was kind of like it was a weird year in that you didn't have to spend around 1 or 2 pick on a tight end to get one of these players on your team. Do you think that's going to shift? Is there any tight end that's really jumped out to you that really is going to justify one of those early picks? Or is it going to probably be similar to this season where it was, around 3, 4, 5 is when we're going to go after our elite guys, and then it's dealer's choice after that?
I think the one guy that you could see really move up into the first or second round, depending on how he finishes, Bowers. Like Bowers is he's on pace to break Puka's record for receptions, rookie record for receptions, which is unbelievable on a terrible team with Gardner Minshew and AOC and who the hell else knows might be starting games for them at QB. But he is just been essentially their wide receiver 1. Like he's gonna and he's a rookie. So I think he's gonna be the tight end 1 next year, pretty much without competition. This is a disappointing year for Laporta. He was the tight end one this year, but he's had injuries. There's a lot of competition for usage over there in Detroit. So he's had a down year relative to where you've drafted him. And McBride, who's probably the next guy there, has been very productive, but I think he only has 1 touchdown on the season. So he's having a year that, like, while he's been very good, he's kind of run unlucky. And yeah, I think there will be some regression. If it doesn't come this year, it'll probably come next year, touchdown wise for him. So I think he's going to be a guy that's drafted high. I mean, Kittle's been awesome, but he's getting a little older. So I don't know if you're going to have to pay a premium for him. And then Kelsey, will Kelsey even play next year? He's going to be 35. Like, if they win their 3rd Super Bowl in a row, I could see him retiring off to the Taylor Swift tour and just like living his life. But I think Bowers is the one that's going to stand out as above the crowd, especially if they get a decent quarterback in there in Las Vegas.
Yeah, so to your point, Trey McBride has 1 touchdown on the season, and it was a rushing touchdown.
Yeah,
which is pretty wild. But yeah, so on the season, Brock Bowers has 89 targets, which that's elite level production. I think that in a situation where it is a tight end premium type league, then without a doubt he's going to be going probably late round 1, which is where Kelsey would always find himself. I think absolutely you can see that happening. But the thing that worries me a little bit about Kittle, because he is so far number tight end 2 on the season, he's injured a lot just because of the way he plays. And a lot of his production is reliant on touchdowns. So, we say it all the time, the touchdowns are, I don't want to say fluky, but they're an unreliable stat, right?
Exactly.
Just because you score, say, 10 touchdowns this season, it's not going to translate to next season, which, just look at Laporta, right? Like, that's exactly how it's playing out. I mean, it was unsustainable, just the amount of touchdowns he was getting. But I agree with you. I think that there's probably going to be, it's going to be Brock Bowers, which if you were doing like a dynasty startup, do you play dynasty football?
I do. I'm in one main league that our buddy Alan Seslowski runs, and Brandon Adams is in it, and like a lot of guys from kind of our group that we know here. So in that league, I made the decision this year that I'm kind of regretting now. I took Neighbors over Bowers in tight end premium, and that was the choice that I made. And I'm like, I love Neighbors. I think Neighbors is awesome. Like, I mean, obviously I'm a Giant fan, and they have no quarterback or team around him right now. But if I could have a mulligan on that, because this is tight end premium, I think I might take Bowers. I think I might have screwed that one up. But
I would never, ever say you screwed up by drafting league Neighbors, Chris.
That's true. I love Neighbors. Neighbors is my favorite player in the NFL right now. But it's a small sample size, but if you look at this season in a tight end premium league, I think most people, if you put like the poll on Twitter, would say I done screwed up.
Maybe you're right. Listen, it is one season. People they love the recency bias. Like, there's no doubt that Brock Bowers is special. And really what it comes down to is, you're getting obviously that extra, usually half a point for reception with the tight end premium leagues, and obviously just replacement value. But I would still rather roll with like an Evan Ingram and a David Njoku as my tight end if I have like a Malik Neighbors on my team. So I don't think you done screwed up. I think that if you drafted Marvin Harrison, we all done screwed up. Listen, we talk about these players to ad nauseum in the offseason and in rookie draft season. And I don't know, man, the drum beat was so strong for Marvin Harrison, even though there was a lot of noise that could have suggested that maybe this season wasn't going to go quite as well as we'd hoped for Marvin Harrison. You have to say this season's been pretty disappointing. And actually, I'm curious. I'm going to see how many people drafted Harrison, because Harrison was going early round 1. Or sorry, early round 2.
He was like the 1-2 turn generally in best ball. And he's had a few spike weeks, but he's not living up to where you drafted him. I think he's been fine, but like he was overdrafted, and the cost, the opportunity cost of taking him at the 1-2 turn means I would guess he doesn't have that great of an advance rate. I haven't looked at his on the
10%.
So it's less than 16% would be average. So he's less than average advance rate this year.
Yeah. So if you were using our draft kits, You would have 0
Zero.
Marvin Harrison Jr. Yeah. I mean, listen, maybe not 0, right? If you're doing lots of drafts, but if you're just an average casual drafter and maybe you did 5 or 6 drafts, you probably have 0 Marvin Harrison, because I just didn't see the path to success. And really what it came down to was, listen, if we were to fast forward to the end of the season, right? And we knew that Kyler Murray was having the season that he's having this year, because frankly, he looks amazing, right?
He looks great. Yeah, he looks
He
like
looks
a whole new
great.
man this year.
Yeah, and he's passing the ball well. I would have thought Marvin Harrison would have been right there in the conversation with Malik Neighbors as rookie of the year, like for the wide receiver position, but it just hasn't really translated.
This might be a different DFS Army show for this point, but I think Kyler and Marvin Harrison are kind of one of my favorite stacks this week for on DraftKings for DFS. I love that game. I love that game environment in Seattle. So I think if I'm doing some single entry stuff, I'm going to have a Kyler Harrison stack and I'm going to run it back with JSN. I'm a JSN bull. That's one of my favorite players in the league. I probably got like 20% of him in best ball. And I think we're finally seeing him kind of come into his own and show the promise that everybody kind of hoped he would have coming out of Ohio State. So I think that's my sneaky little, I don't know if it's sneaky. I think it's going to be a little under-owned, that stack and run back this week. So that's my little one DFS tip for the week.
So first of all, this is the very, very pro JSN show. So you are in good company, Chris. I love JSN, man. It was looking rough last season, and this is just a rule for everybody. And sometimes it's hard to see this as we're doing many teams. Like say JSN had like a slow start last year. You got to trust the process. If you think a player is good and he's got a good head on his shoulders, because I keep pounding this. Jermaine Burton was a player that I was kind of out on this year, and just in general in a lot of my drafts, because he's got all the talent in the world, but he's just a knucklehead, right? He just makes bad decisions. And ultimately, to really succeed at the NFL level, because everybody who steps in that football field, even if they're not actually between the lines and they're on the sideline, these guys are special players. If they were to go play against Shane Sealy and Chris Felicetta in on some field somewhere, they would just absolutely toast us, right? But what really gets you to the next level, it's that work ethic. It's just being like obsessed with football. And JSN is that type of player. So I'm so happy for the kid, because he's finally starting to show it. More importantly, his coaching staff is starting to see it, right? So they're making sure that they're actually game planning to get the ball in his hand. Because listen, Tyler Lockett, like, he's having an exemplary career. He's an amazing athlete, just a great human being. He's past his prime.
Exactly.
It's a DK show, it's a K9 show, and it's a JSN show. I love, actually, dang, that's a really good, that's going to be an exciting game right now.
I love that game this weekend. I think that's going to be one of the more fun games of the week. Yeah.
So one of my favorite tools is just a matchup tool. And if I look at just the implied team totals for both these teams, you've got 23.75 for Seattle and 23.75 for Arizona. So it's an absolute coin flip. Vegas doesn't know what the hell's going to happen, and that means fireworks, baby. So it's going to be a fun one for sure.
Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the quarterback position before we get out of here, because we've talked about the other 3 positions. Quarterback position, I would say it's been a little bit disappointing this year, right? Like, you've got your Lamar Jackson, if you've got Lamar, if you've got Jalen Hurts, like you're pretty happy, but Mahomes has been overly disappointing, right? Obviously, they continue to win games, but so how do you think the community is going to look at the quarterback position next year for drafting early? Joe Burrow, I will admit, I was a little under the field on, because I just wasn't confident that everything was going to come together. There's a lot of noise in the offseason, but if you drafted Joe Burrow, he is the second highest point scorer on the season. Obviously, Baker Mayfield has come out of nowhere, and ladies and gentlemen, Mike Evans is back, which means
he is back.
Baker's going to continue to roll this week. But what do you think the approach for the quarterback position is going to be next year?
I think you're going to see the elite quarterbacks drop a little bit, because like you said, if Burrow, who is going like, a 7th round, 8th round type of guy, is the number 2 overall QB, Baker's right up there, who could be had in like the 12th, 13th round of drafts. I don't think people are going to want to pay up for Allen, for Lamar is having a good season, but I think people lump him and Allen and Hurts and Mahomes, although it certainly hasn't been the case this year, in that same
Yeah.
group where I don't think people are going to want to pay up for quarterback. I think you're going to see a little bit of a leveling there. And I also think that was something that kind of a lesson I took from last year's best ball slate was that it's tough for quarterback to separate. So I didn't want, 2 years in a row, I let Trey Lance stupidly was my number one owned QB 2 years ago in best ball, blows his ACL out, sinks a quarter of my teams. Then last year, who we both love, AR was my number one drafted quarterback. And this is all just relative to where they're going in drafts. Like, I don't think they were the best quarterback, but he was my number one overall drafted quarterback. He's out for the season, sinks a quarter of my best ball teams. So I'm like, I don't think it's wise. The risk reward isn't there to go that high overweight on a particular quarterback because it kind of the production is kind of levels anyway. So I think a lot of people are going to start taking that approach when they see what someone like Burrow has done, when you see what Baker has done, or the sneakiest one I think this year is Bo Nix. Like, Bo Nix has been incredible like the last few weeks for fantasy. And that's a guy that was free. You could have just drafted in the last round. There's drafts where he didn't get drafted at all. And he's like a every week starter now in season long, essentially. So I do think there's going to be a bit of a leveling out at quarterback. Whereas like, in past years you had to take, Josh Allen and Lamar and Mahomes in like the second round. Like, I don't think that's going to be the case at all. I think you're going to see more of like a fourth or fifth round for the top guys is my guess going forward.
Yeah, I can see like the one outlier is going to be the Lamar, just because he's done it this year, and he's if you look at who separated himself from the pack, it's been Lamar. If you took him early, like you don't regret taking him early. But let's go back to this tool. I'm very interested now to see Lamar Jackson advancement rate.
He is my second or third highest owned QB in Best Ball Mania. So that is helping get me a lot of teams in. It was Stroud number one because I just love that stack for their playoff run. But then it was Lamar and Jalen Daniels number 2 and 3. So those guys they are carrying a decent amount of my teams into the play. That's probably why my advance rate is at least average, thanks to those two, despite kind of fading all the league winning backs.
Yeah, so Lamar did help you out. He's at 32.9% advancement rate.
Yeah, that's a big win.
In this case, it double the field. That's definitely a big win. But I'm curious to see Hurts because again, it's all about opportunity cost. If you're drafting this player, what's it gonna take away from another opportunity? Hurts is 21%. And I'm gonna check up Jaden Daniels here. Jaden Daniels is at 18%. So Jaden Daniels,
advance rate guys.
Yeah, so you like to see that. So Chris, as we kind of get to the end of the show here, is there anything you want to talk about? Any lessons learned so far? And listen, we still have lots of time left. There's 6 weeks left before we actually crown a champion in BBM. But so far, again, you can't change anything. What are some lessons learned and just outlook for the rest of the season? Be it Best Ball Mania, be it season long. What are some thoughts that you might have?
I think I got to be a little bit less of an ageist. Like I do tend to hate on the older guys and just always trying to like spot that breakout season, like the season, like what's going to be the legendary season at the best of their career. And it kind of cost me some shares of guys like Kamara and Mixon. Like, I'm never going to be the guy that's overweight, that takes an overweight stance on the 28, 29-year-old running back in their 8th season who's, dealt with some injuries. But I think their roles were so secure that it was stupid of me to at least not be with the field, like not have just, 8% of them is dumb. Like that's just malpractice. So I'm going to learn from that. Like I'm going to pick my spots to at least when someone has a secure role on a good team to try not be an ageist and try to not be a hater on the veterans a little bit more than I tend to be. So I'm definitely not going to be like the boomer, like FFPC guy who like takes running backs around too early. It always sticks with the old dudes, but I am going to rein it in a little bit and try to at least like look at the situation from a more like micro level, be like, okay, Mixon has this backfield to himself. He's going to be a 3-down guy. He's going in the 7th round. get at least with the field. I think that's the lesson I'm going to take from that.
Yeah, well, so we got Dixon Saturn in the chat here saying who you two and what'd you do with Geek Bobby and Jose? Listen, they're thrown away. Now this is the fantasy football channel, Dixon. So you stumbled upon the fantasy football channel. So if you do play season-long fantasy football, give us a subscribe, man. We're up here every single week talking about the slate. We got Chris on the show talking, a little bit something different today. We're reflecting a little bit on best ball on the season and some of the strategy. And the reason I have the college players on the show still is because we are degenerates and we love every single one of those players. And that would be why we do that. So, yeah, man. So I think, Chris, some of the things that I'm reflecting back on, and just as I do the draft kit every single year for dfsarmy.com, there's always that balance between understanding and going with what the market is suggesting, aka ADP, right? And being ahead of those, because ultimately there's this balance between the market knows best and groupthink. And it's a very, very fine line where if you are ahead or below a player, like if you have no exposures, and again, it also depends on how many slates you do. Like if you're yourself and you're doing maybe 100, 150 different entries, that's a completely different strategy than if you're doing 5 or 10 entries. If you're doing 5 or 10, you kind of have to take a stance on certain players and go after those players and go after them hard. But if you are casting a wide net, it makes sense to at least have some exposures to a player like a Joe Mixon. And listen, it's so easy to have hindsight, right? Hindsight bias, where you go back and realize, listen, of course Joe Mixon was a good play. Of course Derrick Henry was a good play. But ultimately it's, it's hindsight bias. But appreciate you, Dixon. We appreciate you subscribing, brother. Okay, we got to help you out. So speaking of season long, would you guys roll with the rest of the year, Kirk Cousins or Baker Mayfield? You have to roll Baker Mayfield, man. He's been absolutely special. The Falcons are tripping over their own feet at this point in the season. And Baker's favorite target, Mike Evans, is back this week. He's healthy. Cross our fingers he stays healthy, because that guy but Baker can lead you to a fantasy championship, which I love. All right, we got all in one show. Also subscribe. Appreciate you, brother. Thanks for jumping on. Or ladies, hard to say. But okay, need some advice. Would you start Jennings this week, even if Purdy is out? I also have Ridley and Waddle on my bench. Christian Watson is sitting on waivers. So of that group, I'm probably rolling with Calvin Ridley. Now,
I was going to say Ridley too. That was my first instinct there.
Now, the thing about Calvin Ridley, if you listen to the show last week, we do our flex plays every single week. It's either myself, Chris will be on the show once in a while, but we got Brandon and Mike that help out. We talk about some of our flex plays of the week, aka start sit decisions, and we had Calvin Ridley in there. Now, Calvin Ridley had a long touchdown. It was called back because of a formation penalty. Okay, the godforsaken formation penalty that didn't exist, Chris, until the 2024 season for some reason.
So annoying.
But you got to trust the process. And the thing is, we were talking about the Titans are expected to be underdogs in that game, but Houston's going to put up points. So I like the idea that Calvin Ridley is going to have to be involved. What's your feeling about Christian Watson? Because this guy's kind of tough, right? Like we talk about best ball. Christian Watson is like the pristine. He's like a Will Fuller, right?
He's the prototype better in best ball guy. Like, I'm happy to have him on my best ball team. I would never feel confident throwing him out there at a season long format. And I looked at him there in that decision point. Like, I think you should pick him up. Like I think the guy or gal who was asking that question said he's on the waiver wire. I would love to have him on the back of a roster, but I'm not starting him over Calvin Ridley. Like I'm like, he's a good guy to have on the team, and he's shown upside, but I wouldn't start him over a player like Ridley.
So we had a question on the show last week about a trade that a person was going to go for to send Jalen Waddle to get Ladd McConkey, but he would have had to drop Jonathan Brooks. I said, I don't want to drop Jonathan Brooks. He's finally healthy. You've been riding him, rostering him all bloody season. I would rather have Waddle plus Brooks versus Ladd McConkey. Last week, Ladd McConkey had a great week, still put up like 15, 16 points. So was it a slate breaker? No. But my question to you, Chris, Jalen Waddle, this was a player I liked a fair amount. I think I had him right about ADP, which is where I was drafting him. But would you drop Jalen Waddle to pick up Christian Watson? Like, are we at that point yet? Or are you still rolling with Waddle?
I think I'd still hold on to Waddle. Waddle is the bane of my fantasy existence this year, and I'll tell you why. Because in my oldest home league, like a league with my college buddies dating back to the late 90s, I clicked on who I thought on Yahoo. I thought I drafted Lamar, but I must have either the website glitched out or I fat fingered it, and I drafted Waddle instead. And then with the next pick, my brother took Lamar, and I was like, and he's running away with the league with Lamar. And now I've got Waddle, who's been literally one of the worst picks you can make this year. But there is a big Waddle week coming. I don't know if it's this week. I don't know if it's next week, but he's still a guy who's 25 years old, maybe. They just gave him
25.
Yeah. They gave him an $84 million contract. They obviously still believe in him. Obviously, A-Chain's taken more of a passing role than I think a lot of people would have anticipated. But as long as Tua's out there and they're competing for a playoff spot, I think we're going to see one or two big Waddle weeks. I don't think they're going to be predictable, but he's a guy I wouldn't give up on him yet. I think there is a moment coming from Waddle this season, but it's not a crazy question. You could certainly, I wouldn't fault you if you picked up Watson over Waddle, but I think I'm still going to stubbornly hold on to Waddle for another week.
Yeah, I have him in one league. I think it's one of my 0.5 PPR leagues, and he's effectively useless in that league.
Yeah, I've had to bench him pretty much all season.
Yeah, I'm looking forward at it. So first of all, in PPR leagues, which is where he's supposed to thrive, week 1 he had 16 points. Since then, he literally hasn't eclipsed 10 points. So that's literally awful. A bust every single week this season. Obviously, part of that was because of Tua being injured, but looking forward, he plays New England this week, which I don't know. There's if you go to the injury reports, there's a lot of questionable players for the New England Patriots. Christian Gonzalez is on there as questionable. If he doesn't play by chance, I think he's going to play. But if he doesn't play, that that probably favors more of a Tyreek Hill with the deep ball. But then you've got Green Bay, a tough matchup, and you've got the Jets, a tough matchup. That's just to get into the playoffs. So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, and maybe I need to look in the mirror with some introspection there. But I think I would rather have Christian Watson on my team because at least Green Bay has a path to the playoffs. And Dontavian Wicks, who we kind of are worried about, he doesn't do much. But if both Waddle and Christian Watson are getting 3-4 targets a week, I'd rather go with the upside of Christian Watson. That
makes sense. And another thing that hurts Waddle, Jonnu's really coming on lately. He's taking up, his target share is on the rise, and he's been really soaking up a lot of usage. So that even leaves less of the pie for Waddle. So that's another thing, strike against him.
He must be hurt, man. Isn't it so strange that you hear at the end of the season, this guy was playing with broken ribs or something like that, right? Where they weren't on the injury report all season, and all of a sudden they were playing with a broken leg. It's what the hell, man?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we heard something like that after the season, that Waddle had some kind of nagging injury or something, because he's a better player than this. He should be getting involved.
He should be, but listen, we only have to go with what we have to go with, and ultimately, as the season has come to where we're at, I think you can drop Jalen Waddle. If you drop him, somebody else picks him up and he has a big week. Well, congratulations. But
that's it. Yeah.
Especially a week like this where you are in do or die mode. If you have Jalen Waddle, you probably took him with your round 2 pick, which means you might be struggling. Right?
Yeah. Yep.
I would say
9th place team.
Yeah, exactly. Or right on that fringe bubble team. You need to win this week. You need to win this week, and Jalen Waddle's not going to get you a win. And say he goes off this week, Chris. Are you going to be confident starting him next week? Or are you going to look at the entire season? No, not really, right? So then at that point...
Maybe you can help me, because I have my decision this week is Waddle or Pollard. Who would you...
definitely
as a flex. Pollard in the flex.
Tajay is hurt, so it's going to be the Pollard season. And I was actually looking at it before the show, because I like to always scan over just what our projections are saying. And over at the at the matchup site, for a full PPR, Tony Pollard is projected at 15.75 points. And he's actually started to look good, right? He's passed the eye test a little bit. So of those two, 100%, 10 out of 10, I'm playing Tony Pollard. And if Jalen Waddle goes off, I'm going to thank you personally, Chris, because you sometimes you got to just make a sacrifice to the fantasy gods, right?
Yeah.
I'm
going to make that. I'll be the sacrificial Waddle lamb this week. I deserve it after that fat fingered misclick that has ruined an entire season for me. So
there you go, brother. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you, all in one show, and thank you to Dixon for the subscriptions today. We really appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in. We're here every Saturday morning. We're going to be here. Actually, I should say that, except for next week, it is the U.S. Thanksgiving. I'm a Canadian, so I don't celebrate your Thanksgiving, but we are going to take the show off next week. For all you, my American friends out there, have an amazing Thanksgiving. Be safe. Don't talk politics at the dinner table, because that's going to lead to just unhappiness and more drinking, which will result in more fighting. So avoid that. Go be safe with your families. Chris, are you doing anything special for Thanksgiving next week?
We are going up to my girlfriend's family's area, upstate New York. So we are going to be up in the cold upstate New York, spending some time up there. So that'll be nice. Eat good, watch a lot of football. It'll be avoid talking politics. It'll be a nice time.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, listen, as a New Yorker, I'm sure you aren't too happy with the political situation, but hey, we're not going to have an opinion as a Canadian. I have my opinion, but we're not going to get into that. We do shows like this to get away from the day-to-day madness that is real life. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining in. Won't be here next week. 2 weeks from now, we're going to help you get into the playoffs. It's going to be, at that point, it's like literally do or die season to get into the playoffs. Hit us up on X at DFS Army, at Chris Felicetta, and at the Flex Network 1. If you want the spelling, go into the show notes below. It's all there. And hit us up with your start state questions. Of course, if you are a DFS Army member, a VIP member, come check us out on the Discord. We're killing it in Discord. And listen, just in the DFS slate, like Chris, I'm sure you follow, but like our guy Geek took down, he finished second in the slate, won 20K a couple weeks ago.
Nice hit.
Yeah, it's a nice hit. And listen, you just search those DFS Army, and it doesn't have to be football. If you like soccer, we had this morning all the soccer show suggestions was in the Discord. We do basketball, we do hockey. We're crushing it in every sport. We do esports, Chris. We do freaking esports, and people are winning money. So helm us up, ladies and gentlemen. Chris, thank you for joining the show. Maybe we'll have to get you on early next season, like a January type thing, to get like some early best ball strategy as we get into February. But appreciate you joining. Appreciate all of you for watching the show, and go crush NFL Week 12.
Big time.